The category is What the Trans, Darling?
Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of What the Trans.
What the trans? We haven't done this for a while.
We haven't, no, and there's been a few reasons for that, which we will get into. But
Yes,
apologies once again for an unplanned and extended absence. I promise you there is a good reason for it, and it's...
Well, there's a few.
There is a few, isn't there? Anyway, so how have you been, Michelle?
I'm all right. My entire life changed in a lot of ways in the space of about 3 weeks. And so I've been putting things together. So yeah, I moved house.
Yes, unexpectedly.
Yeah, well, it wasn't entirely unexpectedly. Like, it was one of those things where I thought, maybe I don't have to move. And then it was like, oh, wait, I do. But then I got a place with a good friend of mine. So I'm now sat in a different part of South London in a room that is slightly bigger with an actual table.
Woo!
Like, I had a desk that the Patreon paid for like years ago that was very small. It barely fit like my laptop, a monitor, and a keyboard on it. If I wanted to put other things on there, I had to put a plank of wood on top of it.
Yes, I remember.
But now, after 4 years of doing this, and I will put this on the socials at some point, I have an actual table where all of like my podcast studio, quote unquote, is maybe half of it. And the other half, I could put crap on it.
Hooray! Yeah, you gotta have...
Not literal crap. I mean, I got a Digimon and some Tamagotchis in a bowl. I got a space for a drink. I have a fan. I have a fan on the desk, like some kind of person in this heat has. None of this was possible before. It was just... My desk would basically be 99% podcast equipment crap and 1% empty cans of Tango. And now it is considerably more empty cans of Tango and a copy of Waking Life on DVD, which, Patrick, if you're listening, I am going to watch tonight after this. By the time you hear this, I will have watched it so we can talk about it. I'm sorry it took this long for me to watch the movie, Patrick. But yeah, that's been me. So with that came reorganizing of my finances. And then I had a family member die right smack bang in the middle of all this stuff. So I've been busy.
Yes.
But that's nothing. Nothing compared to what you have been experiencing of late. Would you like to talk about that now? Or would you like to talk about that after some
I
news?
think it is best if we leave it until later. And just to signal it right here at the top, and we'll do it again before we get into it, but we are going to be discussing some pretty heavy medical stuff. Some of you may find that quite unpleasant. So it's not right now. We're going to do the news first. But once we're through the news, there is going to be a discussion of certain medical procedures and a certain amount of, discussing around that.
It's going to get gross and it's going to get weird.
Yeah, it's definitely going to get weird. But yes, I am basically okay, but we'll go into that a little bit later on. But I'm glad your move's gone all right, because I remember you popped up to say, oh God, I've got to move. I was like, oh gosh, all right. Because even if I was able to travel down to London to assist you, I am not physically able to assist you. So it would have been...
Well, that's what this podcast is going to be about, entirely just me having a go at you for leaving me in my time of need, whilst you were only just in the hospital for the best part of a month. That's nothing compared to what I was going through.
Just lying on my back and eating grapes, yeah. But yes, you've moved, and I'm glad you have, and I'm glad you seem to have landed on your feet with it, in that you found somewhere that's a bit bigger. Because it's always nice to have a little more elbow room, isn't it?
Yeah, my room / studio, I'm going to keep calling it a studio.
As well,
even though it isn't. Well, it is a place where I do this, so it is my studio / bedroom. That's what it is. The rest of the flat is smaller than where I was, but I actually quite like that, because me and my friend don't have the most stuff in the world. And also, it's so much less to clean.
Yes, I suppose it would be.
I used to look at flats where it was like a combined front room kitchen and would just be like, oh, well, that is clearly a landlord really trying to take the piss.
Yeah.
This was not supposed to be a flat, but it is now. They've made it one to capitalize on their investment. And that is true.
Yeah, yeah.
But I have a form of ADHD, which means that remembering to clean and actually doing cleaning is kind of a challenge for my brain. So now I've got one less room to clean.
Okay, I mean, sounds good? Question mark?
Well, I'm paying more and arguably getting less, but I'm
Right.
trying my best to put the best spin on it I can.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that you were paying more. That kind of sucks. Sorry, dude.
Sign of the times, which we will be getting to in this episode, because I mean the news story that I sort of like, I haven't been looking at the news for like the best part of a month. Like when I stopped looking at the news a month ago to sort out all my shit. The cost of living crisis was very much in the news. The Tory leadership contest was getting more and more disgusting across the board, not just like with the transphobia, which has been precedent setting.
Yes.
And probably a sign of what we can expect in the next general election in 2.5 years. And all of this other stuff was going on. It just felt like everything in the United Kingdom was getting worse, and there wasn't any adults doing much about it.
Yeah.
So I got back literally this morning, went online, looked at my news tracker, checked out the socials, and it's all the same.
Yes.
It's just the same. Nothing has changed.
Yeah, sorry, darling.
But and this kind of feeds into all of that. In a strange way that we will get to.
This what we're going to be talking about in the first part of the episode is quite definitely a symptom of the problems you have just described. So shall we get into it?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do the things. Let's go and do some...
Oh, not the news.
Not the news. It's not the news. Oh, God. We always do the news. Why do we do this to ourselves?
I know, right? So let's just get into it. So this is some, but by no means all, of the latest fuckery. I'm going to throw a bunch of things your way that you might not have heard of before, although let's be honest, given our listenership, you almost certainly have. In an ideal world, we shouldn't have to know about this stuff, but because we're trans, of course we have to know everything about, well... Let's just go for it. The NHS Confederation, which actually I was not aware of until they popped up in this particular news story, which kind of demonstrates how much I'm looking at the news recently. It's a membership body for all of the various organisations that provide services on the NHS. It's kind of like a big club for NHS trusts and organisations that provide ambulance services, research trusts, basically all the smaller organisations that when grouped together make the NHS what it is. They are a pretty big deal, as you might imagine, as they try to tie all of these different groups and organisations together and to make the NHS better. That is their stated goal. So on the 24th of August, the NHS Confederation put out a press release about a new trans-positive project that they would like to see done. According to the NHS Confederation, their goal is to essentially hire a researcher or a group of researchers to conduct a review of how trans people in the NHS, whether working in it or as people trying to use NHS services, are treated and how things could be improved. The tender document for this project itself quotes from Stonewall's 2017 trans report and makes the case that accessing NHS healthcare can be problematic, to say the least, for trans people. So the same tender document stated that they are hoping that this review will lead to something of a practical guide for senior NHS leaders and informing them of how to be better allies to trans and non-binary people. And they're offering £20,000 to the organisation that does this review. So, there is an impetus for an organisation to get involved.
Yeah, and that 20,000, I should point out, is for everything.
Yeah.
That's the cost of doing it and paying everyone.
Exactly.
That's basically, here's 20 grand, get it done.
Make sure it's done on this amount of money. So far, so reasonable, I think. And I know when I heard about this particular project, I suppose, or suggestion by the Confederation, I was like, oh, wow, okay, that actually seems kind of positive. Oh, I am cautiously optimistic. And then the Telegraph heard about it. And, well, as usual, they really did have to work hard to make this about something that it isn't, but here's the headline that they chose. NHS group ignoring Tavistock clinic controversy by promoting trans allyship. And so their article, of course, frames this project in the recent bullshit that is floating around the Tavistock clinic closing, and the CAS review as well, and of course features not a single trans person or a healthcare professional for trans healthcare. They didn't even go for a cis person that happens to know a lot about healthcare. No. They went to Maya Forstater, who is an arch anti-trans nightmare who runs the anti-trans hate group Sex Matters, and Stephanie Davis Arai of the nightmarish anti-trans kid hate group Transgender Trend. But this, unfortunately, is not the only story here. This is just one of several similar things that we've seen over time that do this. The warping of reality at work here is amazing, and so let's get into it. Now, just remember this as we go on. This is a £20,000 research project by the NHS Confederation seeking to improve the NHS. The whole NHS, not just trans-specific healthcare, but the whole of the NHS for trans people who are either using the services or working in them. That is it.
Yeah, strap in. So the Telegraph immediately frames this project as a bad thing in the shadow of the fiction surrounding the recent announcement that the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, is to be wound down as 2 new services begin operating, with the view in the NHS to starting a lot more of these services, in line with recommendations from the CAS review. For those who don't know, the CAS review is an independent review established by the NHS to review gender identity-related healthcare for young people. You're under 18s. Some of you may be listening. Hello, young people. I'm old. How's it going?
Hi, guys, and gals, and non-binary pals.
Recently, the CAS review released an interim report that pointed out that having one clinic for the whole of the UK's trans youths, which can't keep up with demand, that was a potentially dangerous situation. And it is, as to anyone who has been through GIDS ever will tell you, it takes way too long.
Yeah.
And the CAS review suggested that multiple regional centres would be better and safer for everyone. Now, this was met with, by the trans community as a good thing, because it's kind of what trans people have been asking for a long time. There being more provision and it more spread out across the country, so people all over the place can actually get it without having to book 3 days off in hotels in London or something. But if you read the UK press about this, you may have been tricked into believing that GIDS was being shut down because they provided trans healthcare at all. That was the problem. This is the context this Telegraph report is trying to latch onto. Davis Arai from Transgender Trend was quoted in the report saying, "The interim report of the case review into the Tavistock clinic was very clear about the failings of the Tavistock because there was an ideological approach driven by activists." This is just total bollocks. How do I know this? Well, 2 things. 1, I actually read the CAS review interim report, which I'm pretty sure Stephanie Davis Arai hasn't. Or if she has, just looked through it for a way she can spin it to make it sound like a victory for her.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only reason these people ever read these reports. So
yeah, they don't read them because, in my case, I'm a nerd who likes doing that. But how else do I know this? Because Hillary fucking Cass from the CAS review herself basically said it was in a post on the CAS review website. There she said in response to this nonsense, "In my interim report, I said that a single specialty provider model is not a safe or viable long-term option in view of concerns about lack of peer review and the ability to respond to the increasing demand. The purpose of the regionalised model is to improve access, networked care, research capacity, and workforce development." So the framing is bollocks. The absolute framing of this article is total shit. But also the relationship that the NHS Confederation review that they want to do in regards to helping trans people and youth healthcare specifically is also so very thin. This review doesn't even appear to be especially looking at trans youths or even gender identity related healthcare at all, but the trans people in general accessing the NHS in general or working in it. The entire context of GIDS closing down and the CAS review recommendations is not only totally bollocks, but not even absolute bollocks that isn't anywhere related to the bollocks. It's 2 sets of bollocks that are not related to each other at all. They're 2 totally separate piles of balls.
It's a quadrangle of bollocks.
Yes, it is a quadrangle of bollocks. It has nothing to do with what is actually fucking happening.
Yes, indeed.
They also then did the thing that the Telegraph usually does, and the Mail jumped on this, of course, and went on and hammered on this point a lot more by saying misleadingly that the £20,000 being put up for tender, being put up to pay for this, is taxpayers' money when it barely is at this point. Now, here's what the Telegraph said. The NHS Confederation is part funded by the taxpayer through membership subscriptions and grants. See what they did there? The NHS trusts and organisations that are members of the NHS Confederation, they are funded by public money. That's just how they work. And they spend some of that on membership dues to the NHS Confederation. The link between this being taxpayers' money is so fucking thin. They actively try to make out that this is taxpayers' money when it kind of stopped being taxpayers' money 14 financial steps before it even hits the NHS Confederation. Like, they're really stretching this to make it sound like to the bigoted reader of these outlets, oh, you're paying for this nonsense. And it is nonsense because, look, it's linked to the dangerous Tavistock thing. That thing that we say is dangerous when it's not. But it kind of was, but for different reasons. Yeah, it's your money being spent on poisoning children. That's what this is. That's what the whole framing of this is, when it just isn't.
Yeah.
And they do this to make Maya Forster and her pals not sound out of their mind when they make misleading claims about the NHS being politicised with this. Because that's part of this too. How anything remotely trans positive anywhere is politicising, and that is bad. That's the latest line that seems to be being used very commonly amongst a certain class of bigot. But the long and short of this is, the reality of trans anything in the press is thrown out these days wholesale to sell a fantasy. In this case, the fantasy is that the NHS is spending taxpayers' money to spread gender ideology to staff, in spite of a trans clinic just being closed because trans healthcare itself is dangerous. But the actual truth is so much more boring. The NHS Confederation are offering 20 grand to do research on how to help trans people using the NHS. I mean, the whole thing is a joke, especially in the context of the NHS crisis that is unravelling right now, with demand going up and Liz Truss today announcing that she wants to cut funding for the NHS. And they're choosing to focus on this part of things. 20 grand of not really taxpayers' money being spent on a research thing. I'm at a loss.
Yeah, I know.
I'm at a loss, considering the situation that everyone's in with the cost of living crisis and everything else, that they're focusing on how trans is bad. We're becoming the fucking scapegoats of the next economic downturn. You can see it happening.
Yes, in real time.
Yeah.
It's impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, like last time it was, The Big Short made the big point that it would be immigrants, poor people, and teachers that paid for the last economic downturn in 2008. They were the scapegoats. This time it's probably going to be all of them, and trans people on top. We're going to be the next players in this. That's what a sign of this is. What do you think, Ash? I
think you're absolutely right in your analysis. It's really, it makes you literally sick, particularly when Truss and Sunak come out and make statements about the NHS that either they're lying about, or they're saying something awful that they're going to sell off the NHS and strip mine its assets and privatise everything for a nice big paycheck for them and their friends. And that's the stuff where they're being honest. The stuff they're being honest about is just as scary as the stuff that they lie about. And it's just, as you say, it does feel like we're going to be scapegoated. We already are being scapegoated for so many different issues by so many different sections of the press and the government, and it's enough to make a person quite frustrated and more than a little bit scared, I feel.
What's coming when it comes to the cost of living is going to hit trans people pretty hard, because these things tend to hit minority groups harder. We don't tend to have as much money. We don't tend to have as many opportunities in work, but then there are still trans people who are kicking ass, obviously. There are trans people who are still reaching the heights of all sorts of things in spite of everything, and they are all my fucking heroes. But, if you take the trans community as a group, there's definitely been research that has shown that, we earn less as a group. We have less spending power anyway. And so portraying, one of the few things that could actually help trans people in some way as the problem during all of this oncoming financial fuckery. And, oh my God.
I know. I know, and
they're doing it for money.
Yeah.
They're doing it for fucking money.
Well, of course.
Like that's there's some people out there that I've talked to who are convinced that there's some kind of big grand conspiracy.
Yeah.
That all of these different people are in rooms together making a plan to try and especially fuck over trans people because they're connected to, big silent global forces and stuff.
Yeah.
And there is something to say that there is an organized anti-trans, anti-LGBT, anti-woman movement that is definitely out there with a lot of money in it. But when it comes to this stuff in the press, I have an idea on how this story happened. I think that Maya Forstater and maybe Stephanie Davis are right, but almost certainly Maya Forstater and Sex Matters, her hate group, emailed the journalist saying that they are doing this, or they put out a press release saying that they have emailed the NHS Confederation demanding that this not happen and have made complaints and all sorts of stuff. And the Telegraph have just published it, essentially.
Yeah.
I've taken that press release and just published it. And maybe they put a call in to Stephanie Davis O'Reilly because they have her fucking number.
Oh, yeah.
And they just put this together in the space of an hour. Because that's kind of how a lot of the press works. They just take a press release and they churn it. They just churn it out. They just churn out the press release. Journalism, the phrase sort of thought up by Nick Davies, the great investigative reporter, who used to do great stuff for The Guardian. He was one of the people on the team who helped out WikiLeaks originally with the big drop of files that showed that America were doing war crimes in Iraq.
Yeah.
He was on that team, and he came up with the phrase journalism.
He did.
Which would explain where this fucking story came from.
Yeah, just kind of churning, which, just in brief, is, as Michelle has already said, it's just literally taking everything that comes down off, from AP or the Newswire or any little press release that you get and just basically copying it in verbatim and then putting your own name on the article. And it is, as you say, just churning it out. And it's just... That's why one of the reasons, rather, that so much misinformation and misleading, semi-truthful information has made it into the newspapers. It's because there's been a tremendous failure of, well, obviously, as you might imagine, it's a failure of capitalism because it always is, but actual experienced journalists are not what's needed anymore. People that do actual investigative stuff they're not a priority because it costs too much. People flying out on expenses to do interviews and so on. It's not just firing out dozens of articles per day to be published literally tomorrow with spelling mistakes and misleading information intact because the owners of the paper don't care. Well, the news organisation, the owners of that organisation don't care about good investigative reporting or telling the truth or uncovering corporate and governmental malfeasance. It cares about, you've guessed it, it cares about the profit. And so when the profit is prioritized, the truth can and does suffer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for that aside to take quite so long, but yeah.
It was a good aside because you're right. I mean, there are good journalists out there and good places doing good work. You've got Byline.
Absolutely.
You've got Open Democracy. You've got a few others in that sort of space. And sometimes there are investigative units at newspapers that do all right. I mean, the Telegraph, over 10 years ago now, they were the ones behind the expenses scandal.
They were, yeah.
Guardian has done a lot of good work there, but that stuff's expensive and slow. This kind of story, I'm pretty sure, came from just the guy was checking his email and he got one from Sex Matters, whether generated from a newsletter or they just got it direct because they have a relationship with the journalist, which wouldn't surprise me at this point.
No.
So they can basically just get their PR crap published in major outlets, and it has a knock-on effect because after the Telegraph article, the Mail jumped on this.
Yes.
Too. Either they saw the Telegraph article we can get in on this, and they basically just cannibalized an already regurgitated press release, or they got the press release themselves and were just late.
Yeah.
I can't know that. I can't know which one. Although the Daily Mail one was slightly different in that they did put more focus on the guy that runs the NHS Confederation, pointing out that he used to advise Labour on policy years ago, and all this other stuff. So it was a lot more Well, there's a lot more Daily Mail about it.
Yeah.
A bit more GB News about it. Just a bit shitter than the Telegraph's, which was already pretty shit.
Yeah.
But they cannibalise each other. Like they'll have one anti-trans story that comes up in one place, and then everyone will do it. We saw that with the Ian Huntley is trans, the Soham child murderer is trans stories that came out years ago. Where the Daily Star reported it, then everyone carried it. And then 2 years later, every single one of them had to retract and apologise because it turned out it was complete bollocks
Because of course it was.
Because it was churned out. Fully churned out. They probably got, like, one person at the start probably spoke to one inmate at a prison, and that was the one source, and that one source was full of shit. Originally. But it spread so far. The truth, it took 2 years for the truth to catch up with that one, and that's just the nature of the media that we've been talking about for 4 years now on this pod. But in the current situation of endless crises that we seem to be in, it's really letting everyone down so much. It really is.
Yeah.
We deserve better than this. We really do.
Yeah, agreed. And, it's not just... obviously, it's... trans people, that's who we are, and that's who I think we're, for the most part, talking to, our lovely, wonderful, and may I say, looking delightful today, sexy audience members. All of whom are engaged to a higher degree than most, your average sort of cis people. Perhaps, I think a lot of trans people have shown a little bit more knowledge of and interest in the things the government says and does that directly affect them, because we have to worry about those things, and a lot of cis people don't. Putting it completely unvarnished is that they've never had to go through quite a lot of the things that minoritized communities have to go through and have had to go through for decades, if not hundreds of years in some cases. And so it's very frustrating, because half the time you want to try and inform people, entertain and educate, but there's so much context that you have to explain every single time. It's much easier having an audience of trans people like we do. Hi guys, love you all. Mwah, mwah.
Yeah, I was recently watching news on television. I was in a hotel room, and so I stuck on the TV for a second, and instead of doing what I usually do, which is reading news, I listened and watched news. And they were asking people in Darlington, up north, who do they think should be the next Prime Minister, basically. And one of the people answering, there was this guy, and he just said this thing that stuck with me forever. That will stick with me for the rest of my life. Maybe we should give Liz Truss a go. I mean, the women won the Euros, didn't they? And most of the answers they got from Vox Pops on the street that they chose to put in were of that level of engagement.
I see.
Like, I couldn't... I've been around trans people for a long time who are quite engaged for the reasons that you said. We have to be. And then there's these people who were put on BBC News in the early evening who were just like, they don't know who Liz Truss is. And that's terrifying to me. They're going to find out.
Oh, yes.
They're going to find out by January next year. They're going to know who she is then. Because, I'd like to think this has got all the stink of every time the economy goes wrong, the government changes.
Yes, okay.
That seems to be a pattern. Like the last one was blamed on Gordon Brown, which is weird because Gordon Brown, to my knowledge, wasn't a mortgage broker in New York City in 2007. So I'm not sure exactly what he had to do with the economic crisis directly, but whatever. This time, I think this is probably all going to be blamed on the Tories, which you could argue is kind of unfair because they didn't create the situation in Russia directly.
No.
But they did absolutely create a situation where everyone's pay has been stagnant for over a decade and all the public services are falling apart and everything's going to shit. So that is definitely on them.
That is absolutely on them. Yeah, and yet, just as a mild aside, I promise it'll be a relatively short one, you do still occasionally get members of the Conservative Party trying to blame the problems that we have today on the fact that it was Labour. It was Labour. It was something that Labour or the coalition government did. And it's like, you guys have been in power now for over a decade, and doing a horrible job of it the entire time. You know, you've made this bed, now you can lie in it, you horrible, horrible fucks.
Should we move on to the next thing?
Yes, we should.
Yes, no more NHS things, at least until later on. But we'll get to that. But right now, moving on from the press being weird to trans people making things, YouTuber and friend of the podcast Abigail Thorn, famous from Philosophy Tube, has written and has been performing in her own play. It is called The Prince, and it is pretty trans, and it is pretty Shakespearean. By the time you hear this, its run at the Southwark Playhouse in London will be done. But Ashleigh and the team went to see it and had a chat with Abigail. And here is that chat.
So, Abigail Thorn, thank you so much for sitting down with us. We've just watched the play, The Prince, here at the Southwark Playhouse. We're backstage in this living, breathing, rumbling and slightly noisy place. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Tell us a little bit about The Prince.
The Prince is my debut play, and we just had our press night after 4 previews, and to get a standing ovation on press night is something very, very special. I've chatted to a few reviewers who seem to really enjoy it. So yeah, it's been quite a spectacular journey, and it seems like the show is off to a strong start. Touch wood.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd say that. I was a little bit... Okay, so when the play starts, we're in Shakespeare, quite specifically in Shakespeare, and I wondered, am I going to be able to follow this? Because it's been a long time since I particularly engaged with Shakespeare on any level. So what was behind the decision to actually start the play with that as the sort of framing device, with Shakespeare specifically?
I knew I wanted to write a play about characters who were both immersed in and resistant to a system. There's an obvious kind of trans angle to that, but also like some of the cishet characters and some of the like cis queer characters are also there. And I thought Shakespeare would be good because people have particular expectations when they come to Shakespeare. It has a weight and a seriousness to it, and a kind of you're supposed to take this seriously, which spoke to me very much. I thought it was like isomorphic to the experience of being closeted as a trans woman. And I also, I enjoyed the idea that Shakespeare has a rhythm, the verse to it, like something that kind of propels you along. There is a way that you are supposed to do it. And that also lent itself quite well to kind of to talking about being closeted. So I guess it just matched. It just had all the right ingredients.
I do see what you're saying in terms of the rhythm and the things that feel like you're supposed to say to conceal a facet of one's identity. So how did the previews go?
Previews went really, really well, actually. We had 4 previews, 3 standing ovations, and the one that didn't was the matinee, so everyone's just had lunch, so they're a bit sleepy. We've had majority queer audiences in all the previews, and tonight it was very interesting to hear, because press night, a lot of the press, present company excluded, of course, are quite cishet and a bit sort of small c conservative. And it was really interesting tonight to hear the queer members of the audience like fighting against the cishets. But for the first half hour tonight, the cishet audience were like, no, this is our play, we'll be very respectable. But like by about half an hour in, but there's a particular line that's gotten a round of applause every time it's said. And tonight the applause was a bit like, whoa, whoa, hey! And we're just like, yes, now the queer people in the audience are running the show. Yes. So that was really, really lovely to hear. But previews have gone really, really well. People really like it.
Yeah, well, I really liked it, I have to say. I used to be engaged with theatre to a far greater level than I am now. I used to be in stuff, I've read a lot of scripts. But then life gets in the way and I needed to get a job and blah, blah, blah. So I really hope this continues to go well for you. This trajectory is something that sees you become tremendously successful and the advocate for the trans community that you already are. So, what's next for Abigail Thorn? What's after The Prince?
Well, I can't talk about that at the moment. I'm sorry. The producers have said that I shouldn't talk about what might be happening after this. But there are plans.
There have been a few people who found a lot of success on YouTube and then transitioned into doing something else, be that being a novelist or an actress. Are you planning to stick with YouTube as you carry on with your theatrical endeavours?
Well, I'm starting to realise actually that by combining them, I could create something more powerful than either could be alone. The way that we financed The Prince was by striking a deal with Nebula and Curiosity Stream, and I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not had my existing audience. I mean, we sat down with the CEO of Standard, Dave, and being the producers of The Prince, and Dave said, "How much do you need to make this play really kick ass?" And we told him the number, and he was like, "Cool, anything else?" And we were like, "Do you want to read the script?" And he was like, "Nope, Abby says it's good, I believe in it." So that was that. And if I am transitioning into doing more acting related stuff and writing my own work, then it would be foolish to sort of throw away an audience of 1.3 million at the time of recording. So I think I'm interested in how I can combine the two, actually, and if things go as they seem to be going from previews, then they're like, okay, that's an interesting way to go. We had a guy in 2 nights ago who'd never been to the theatre before. He was like, "I love your show," and I came to the theatre for the first time ever and I loved it. And I was like, okay, that is interesting.
It's an interesting position to be in, and I genuinely look forward to see what you do next.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sitting down with us.
My pleasure, thank you.
So, Ashleigh, I took the night off.
Indeed you did.
Not gonna lie, it was cool. I would have loved to have seen the play, but I needed the night to basically not leave the house and not think about anything. But you went on the town in London with the team. How was the play?
I did. So it was. So I've not been to see very much theatre at all recently. I used to. This won't surprise anybody who's listening, I'm sure, but I used to actually tread the boards myself. Did some acting for my local theatre group, and they've got their own building, so it's an actual theatre, even if it is only quite small. So it is called, wait, you'll like this, Wigan Little Theatre. So, and the last time I went to see a play of any stripe was there, in sort of February 2020, right before everybody went into lockdown. But interestingly, that was a Shakespeare play that I went to see. So, I say in the interview that I wasn't totally familiar with Shakespeare. That's slightly a lie, but equally, I didn't want to dump my life story onto Abigail Thorn. I'm sure that wouldn't have been particularly interesting or enlightening for her.
I disagree. I would have thought that would have made great content. You just listing all of your knowledge about Shakespeare to Abigail Thorn, who was clearly there just, to talk about the reason everyone was in the room.
Which was, of course, The Prince, which is... it's an excellent bit of work, it really is. So someone in our household actually has a Nebula and Curiosity Stream subscription. So even though I went down to see it once, I am interested to watch it again on the filmed version. So we're basically following 2 characters in a play who start to suspect that they are in fact characters in a play. And the sort of journey that these 2 characters go on, basically jumping through different Shakespeare scenes. So if there's Henry IV Part 1 and another one, which I don't want to spoil the surprise of. So these 2 characters who are they're moving a lot more quickly than the other actors. They're kind of zooming around while everyone else is stood fairly still while they're, delivering Shakespearean dialogue, some of which was in fact written by Thorn rather than by Shakespeare. So some of the dialogue within the play, she has written it specifically to ape that dialogue, which is an achievement in itself, because I wouldn't be able to point out to you where the transition points would be. Again, I'm not an actor, so why would I have any more expertise than anybody else?
And Abigail did that stream years ago now where she read live every single Shakespeare play, like every one. So
it was the complete works, wasn't it? It was the plays and the sonnets and everything. So
she knows the words. She knows the bard.
Oh yes, she does. And so there's a lovely bit of dialogue actually between these 2 characters who are kind of play jumping, and then one of them turns around and interacts with a character who is still stuck in the play, as it were. I'm moving my fingers to show air quotes, even though that we're just recording the audio for this. Nobody can see me do the air quotes. But a joke is made of that rhythm, the iambic pentameter that the plays use. So it's as you probably guessed, I did really like this. I think if you're a bit worried that you wouldn't necessarily follow Shakespearean dialogue, please do not worry. In fact, again, that's something else that the two play jumping characters make a joke out of. Is that, can you understand a word of what they're saying? Sort of thing. And I think, as you heard in the interview, Abigail Thorn kind of, came to the conclusion that Shakespeare's got its own sense of queerness, and having listened to the rationale for that, I can agree. I think, I see where she's coming from with that. And that kind of having to hide things away or feeling the need to do so and such. There's a lot of commonality of theme, let's say. So, yes. So when we walked into the Southwark Playhouse and we saw that it was like a performance in the round, rather than everybody's facing the same direction looking at the stage. The stage is in the middle and everybody's looking into it from different angles. I did wonder, okay, so how is this going to be translated to Nebula? How is this going to be translated to a filmed version? And I'm still curious to find that out, which is kind of why I want to watch it again on Nebula. But yeah, it was a very enjoyable evening, and it was fantastic to get the opportunity to sit down and have a chat with the creator. I'm not sure I acquitted myself very well during that, because I was very, very tired and in a lot of pain. But
I wouldn't have known if you didn't say. I wouldn't have any idea.
Oh, I don't know. I listened back to it and I could hear myself going, oh, come on, Ashleigh, get to the point. You
can hear that because that's you. You're looking 2 centimetres away from the picture, whereas I come in later from behind. You can see the whole thing.
Yeah, that's fair.
And they're just like, yeah, you did good. But yeah,
I think so.
But yeah, so if you want to see the prints for yourself, it will be available soon to watch with a subscription from nebula.tv. So if this has piqued your interest, as it has
and
mine,
it should have done,
go check it out there. But now we're getting into the meat of things.
Yes.
Because the meat is going to be about a trans person who recently has had to engage with the NHS considerably more than I think most trans people will have at this point. And that person we've invited to come on the podcast today, and that person is indeed Ashleigh Talbot, who's already here. So that was handy.
Oh, okay. I was going to say,
that was really handy guest procurement for me. Just like,
Is it anyone I know? Yeah. Yeah, you're quite right. So as we kind of foreshadowed somewhat at the top of the episode, I was indeed in hospital for nearly a month in July. So that was my July gone. We'd had vaguely planned to maybe go to Trans Pride Brighton, but I'm glad we didn't make any firm plans and properly booked stuff to go and do it, because I wouldn't have been able to go because I was in hospital. So yeah, I will try and be brief. So I went in to Salford Royal, where the neurology department for I think the whole of Greater Manchester, actually, because when I was outside vaping and other people were outside also vaping or smoking, I'd be chatting to people who were from Wigan, say, and various other places that are within Greater Manchester, who had been transferred to Salford from other hospitals. So I think that's where, if you've got a problem with your brain or your nerves and you live in Greater Manchester, they eventually pack you off to Salford Royal. So what did I have done?
For people who may not know already, why were you there?
Why was I there? Because earlier this year I was provisionally diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, otherwise known as MS. And so this hospital visit was there to turn my provisional diagnosis into an official one, which we've done that. It's official. I have the kind of multiple sclerosis that doesn't remit. So it's the multiple sclerosis that you saw the president get in the West Wing, where it comes on and then is off again for a few weeks or months, and then it's on, and then it's off, it relapses, it remits, etc. I don't have that type of multiple sclerosis. I have the type that starts and just progressively gets worse. And it kind of sucks, and it's not been much fun, but this is why I was going into the hospital, to have a load of tests done and hopefully work out some treatment. And indeed, while I was in the hospital, I actually started some treatment, which I will get into shortly. So the first thing that had to happen was another MRI scan to see, A, how things have progressed since January, but also because they had like a more powerful machine, or a different type of machine that scans in a different resolution, or I don't know. If someone's an MRI machine operator who's listening to this is probably shouting at me right now, and for that I apologise. But anyway, so I got wheeled into the room where the MRI machine was, and previously it was like a cylindrical thing that was half sticking out of a wall. This one was kind of spherical and was like kind of sat by itself in the middle of the room, and all around the room were like purple uplights. It was very chill in there, but it looked like something from the future. It looked like the MRI machine off the USS Enterprise, from Next Generation or something. Unfortunately, I wasn't expecting this to happen. I was being put into the MRI machine, and I had a panic attack, and I've never had a panic attack in my life before. I didn't know what they feel like. I didn't know what the experience was, so I didn't know what to look out for. But I was having trouble breathing, and I was crying, basically. And so that when you're crying, you kind of have some, your kind of movement is jerky, isn't it? And not like the delicious kind of beef. I mean, you're kind of juddering and shaking because, you're crying and stuff. It's kind of, everything's a bit staccato.
Not conducive for having your brain scanned by a big Star Trek machine.
Exactly. It's very important for you to keep still when you're having your brain scanned by any sort of machine now, I think. But that had to be done first because there was a whole battery of tests that they signed me up for, like it's an after-school program or something, that they wanted to do. And the MRI had to go first. And so basically my first few days in hospital were kind of just waiting around for stuff to happen. So eventually the MRI scan was done. And then the next day I had a lumbar puncture. Now, I don't know if you know specifically what one of those is, but the Americans... all of them. No, so it's occasionally referred to in the US as a spinal tap. And yes, that is where the name of the fake band comes from. And it's where they get you to lie down sideways and pull your legs up in front of you so your spine is curved, and then they drain off some of the cerebrospinal fluid from your spine. So that was unpleasant, and...
that sounds like something from a fucking horror movie.
Yeah, so they showed me the size of the needle they used afterwards and the several vials of fluid that they just removed from my spine. I thought it would be several small containers. No, it was several, sizable containers, and they said you need to lie down for the next few hours, like okie dokie. And as soon as I tried to get out of bed several hours later to go to the bathroom, it was incredibly painful, to the extent that I would say that procedure made the symptoms of the MS worse for several weeks, really. It's only just stopped feeling that awful. Anyway, so yes, moving on real quick. So they have this fluid to do tests on. They've done blood tests. They've done an MRI. So then a neurologist was happy to come down. Well, happy is probably not the right word for it, but a neurologist did come down and say, look, it looks like your diagnosis is primary progressive multiple sclerosis, so we'll give you some treatment. So the first treatment they told me about, what was done, is plasma exchange. Now, I don't know if any of our wonderful, sexy listeners know what that is, but basically they take the liquid part of your blood out and replace it with donated plasma, or albumin it's called sometimes. Look for the new albumin. It's out now. if you know, you know. So the plasma exchange had to be done 5 days in a row, and it was such a weird feeling because they'd have me sat on it.
They put like a pipe in your neck.
Oh God, they did. Yeah, so that was unpleasant in and of itself, really, because there's a. You know what a cannula is, or cannula? I'm not sure how you say it.
It's a thing they stick in you to put stuff in.
Exactly. It's a thing they stick in you that puts stuff in you. And it's rather than them having to give you do a different injection potentially several times a day, it's just a little line with a valve on it that they put into your veins somewhere, and then something can be attached to it and put into you that way. But unfortunately, this pipe that went into my neck was 3 or 4 inches long and was sticking out of my shoulder, like sticking straight up and a little bit forward, so I could actually see this thing bobbing around in my peripheral vision. And it was painful for it to be there, and it was painful for me to turn my head in either direction, and annoyingly it went in on the side of me that I normally lie on to sleep. So obviously you're in a hospital bed, you tend not to be sleeping brilliantly anyway, and that just made it worse. So that was...
Oh, God.
Yeah.
They couldn't have picked a worse place for the horrible thing.
Exactly. And initially I thought it was going to be like a cannula, just, on my neck, fairly small little thing. But no, and I saw the guy that was coming out of the room before I went in, coming out with this massive thing sticking out of his neck. And I was like, is that what's going to be done to me? Yes. Oh, hell. Because I nearly withdrew my informed consent there and then, but then I would have had to wait another week for them to decide that getting it through the wrist was all right and blah, blah, blah. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll just have to suck it up. So, yes, there's something related to that line in that I will come back to, but... So I got this aerial sticking out of my neck, and the next day the plasma exchange started. So the plasma is not kept, when it's being stored, it is not kept at human body temperature. So it's going in, and it feels cold. And
like they just got it from the fridge?
It wasn't, because I saw the room that it was stored in, because we went past it and the nurse grabbed it out of the storeroom, and so I actually had the box of plasma on my lap as I was getting wheeled over to the ward where they were doing it. So it didn't feel like it had been refrigerated within the last sort of 24, 48 hours. But it has been stored in a room which is not kept at the same temperature that the human body works at. So this stuff's going in. So
it was like they were injecting you with ice cream.
Kind of, yeah.
Bloody ice cream.
Yeah. Yes, and it was yellow, which is really strange because it turns out blood, when you filter out all of the red blood cells and the white blood cells and various other things, when you filter all of that non-liquid stuff out, it's like a slightly viscous yellowish stuff. So they put in, every day they came down and did 6 bottles of this stuff into my, into this pipe in my neck, and they filtered out an equal amount of my existing plasma. So it was really unpleasant, and it kind of wiped you out for the day. You have this treatment, and then after which you're really quite tired. So, yeah, and then after that, they said, okay, we'll get you onto something called Ocrevus, which sounds like a planet in Doctor Who, The Ocrevusians have fought against the Cybermen, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so Ocrevus is this stuff, which is kind of one of the few treatments for the type of MS that I have. So I'm glad it exists. Because if it didn't, then they would have just said, yeah, we're just going to have to give you painkillers. And let the disease condition let it take its course, and that would have been even more frustrating than it actually has been. So I would say at this point I was absolutely itching to go home, right? I'm sick of all the pain I'm in, I'm sick of not getting any sleep. It's all a bit much, and my mental health while I was in the hospital was not great. Because it just felt like I had already died and I was already in hell because it seemed that the only thing that happened to me was I would suffer. And, so I spoke to a mental health nurse a couple of times while I was in there. And also, I spoke to, and you may laugh, you may be surprised, but I spoke to the hospital chaplain, she was great. And, they listen. They're great listeners, in fact. So it was lovely to see her. She came down to see me 3 or 4 times over the course of the 3 weeks that I was in there. Well, 3.5 weeks. And yeah, it was nice to see her each time. And I now have some ongoing mental health support. So I'll be, speaking to them tomorrow, in fact, as we record this. So, there are things that are happening that don't involve me going back to hospital for a month.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad to hear that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad that that's a one-time thing. A month in hospital is not fun.
Yeah, it is not.
And let alone, anyway.
Yes.
But I don't think people should know what colour blood really is.
Right, okay.
That's one of the things like professionals should know, but you shouldn't know that, and now you do.
Yeah.
And that's wrong.
Yeah, it is a bit weird. But, so just to wrap this bit up then, what I will say is that every single member of staff, except one, was brilliant, right? So in terms of when, at one point they had to put a catheter in, unfortunately, and so there was several quite charged conversations that's probably going to not be helpful in terms of dysphoria. So it wasn't in for very long before it was taken out and something different was used. And that was fantastic.
For people that may not know, a catheter is a thing that basically goes right up your pee hole.
Yes.
To basically make sure that weeing isn't going to be a concern.
Yes.
For various reasons. And they're not fun. I had one once, and it was not fun. So I know your pain on that one, because for trans people, the pee hole area,
can be
whatever configuration you have, that's an area that you don't tend to want to focus on.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I talked about this to one of the nurses, and they were like, oh, okay, yes, that's a good point. Let me see what I can do. And so urology came down and said, okay, well, there's this other thing that we can do. So yes, we can remove it. And removed it was. At no point was I misgendered, nor was my gender identity questioned. People actually corrected. So I say I wasn't misgendered. I was once or twice, but people immediately corrected themselves. And for the most part, the staff were brilliant. And that relates to what we were talking about earlier on with the Tories and their chronic underfunding of the NHS. There were several procedures and tests and things that, as I've mentioned, I had to wait for quite a while. The staff are extremely overworked and evidently underfunded. And that's not something that exists in the abstract for me anymore. I saw it. I saw the effects that it has on people who are trying to do their job. That job which is helping other people through what's potentially the most difficult time of their life, whether they're battling cancer or they have some sort of degenerative condition. When people are in hospital, it tends not to be a nice time for them. And the NHS staff that were there, and particularly the nurses and support workers, were brilliant. There is no other way to describe it. So unfortunately, when my line in was being put in, the one exception to the NHS is brilliant. So the one member of staff who was not very nice wasn't transphobic about it. He was just a bit of a moody sod. And this was the guy who was putting the line into my neck. And I was having a bit of an emotional moment, and I was crying slightly and trying to keep still, and he shouted at me, "Calm down!" And that's the opposite of good bedside manner, my dude. Just...
Yeah, what was he? Was he like a technician or a nurse or a doctor?
He was a doctor, yeah. Doctor... no, I probably shouldn't say his name. But yeah, he was a doctor.
That kind of makes sense to me in a weird way. I've talked to a lot of doctors in my time, and they will be the first to say that doctors aren't are usually the worst. Like, if you had to rank people, are usually the worst when it comes to talking to patients.
Yeah.
Because they don't do it nearly as much as you would think.
Yes, a lot of it's paperwork and a lot of it's doing treatments, but yes, doing the actual
It's
talking.
Nurses and healthcare assistants who are there 3-4 times a day talking to the patients, and then they go and tell the doctor things, and the doctor tells them what to do.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to defend this guy.
No.
Even if you don't talk to people that much, that is inexcusable to start screaming at the people you're trying to help. That is fundamentally wrong.
It's not how it should be. And you know, I did express a certain amount of annoyance with this because he shouted at me to calm down, and I said back to him through gritted teeth, "I am trying." So, you know, it's not something that you do deliberately, is it? Well, it's not something I do deliberately.
Yeah, and you know what? Getting MRIs and getting stabbed in the neck with a pipe.
Yeah.
It may be every day for you in Doctor Land, but this is my first time, and it's happening to me, so maybe give me a fucking minute.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so, yeah. Basically, I do not recommend having MS because the stuff they need to do to sort out treatment and such, it's not a great deal of fun. So even though 99.9% of the staff were brilliant, obviously the stuff that they had to do to provide treatment or to, you know, perform a test was not much fun, unfortunately.
It's amazing that, like, in spite of all of the shit with the NHS that is going on, that you're still like, oh, the staff are great.
Yeah.
You would expect, based on everything that you're hearing about the NHS, either from people who are in it or reports around it, that the place, that every hospital's on fire.
Yeah.
Or something. That there's always some kind of government minister in the back somewhere just punching people in the waiting room or something, like, is the impression I would get. But then on the ground, people are still trying to make it work.
Yeah.
As best they can.
Well, of course they are.
In the worst of circumstances. It's such a weird situation they've got us in, this lot. They really have.
Yeah, it's not great.
And people are still trying to make it work.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that it's done.
Yes, me too.
You don't have to necessarily go through something as intense and as long as that for a while, if not ever.
Yeah, I certainly hope not. God, it was a lot.
What a bad month.
Yeah, it wasn't great. And as I said, I mean, it was July as well, so that incredibly hot Monday and Tuesday that we had in mid-July was just, you know, and I was in a hospital for, well, all of it, but, you know, I was mostly sat in my room waiting for somebody to turn up and either tell me a thing or so I could ask them a thing or give me a thing or do a procedure at me, you know? Having said that, it's not like I'd have gone and sat in the sun that day anyway, because it was 40-odd degrees in Manchester, which is terrifying, really.
That's the other crisis.
Yes.
That we haven't even touched on, the climate change thing. Oh, wow, there's so many crises.
I know.
So many.
We have a delightful selection of number one priorities, don't we?
Yeah, I was recently in a hospital because I mentioned that, like, a family member passed away.
Yes, indeed.
I was there for 2 days, and walking to the ward where my family member was, there was no ceiling along the hallway. Then you got into the ward and it looked like a hospital ward, and I was talking to someone who worked at the hospital, and he was just like, oh, it's been like that for a very long time. You know, like things like that in the NHS, if they're not absolutely required, they're probably going to get left. Like, when I say there was no ceiling, like, there was no, you know, on the ceilings you can get the paneling, and then underneath that there's all the wires and stuff from lights and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, the paneling was gone, and you just had this big gaping hole full of, like, brickwork and wires and metal rigging and all sorts of stuff. And I was just walking through, just like, this is like walking through a hospital after the collapse.
Yeah.
But then I got to the ward, and it was just a functioning ward. But then they were having trouble with the heat because they didn't have any aircon built in or anything, because not for any other reason than a hospital up north didn't used to need aircon.
Yeah, yeah.
The infrastructure wasn't built for dealing with the heat. So the most of the time I was there, I saw staff members being run off their feet, probably running too many patients for them to handle, and trying to keep all of them cool during this heat wave. And it looked like an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
And still, they did their job, you know?
Yeah.
My family member was there, and basically it was an end-of-life deal. He was going to be dead very soon. Well, I didn't really know that before I got there. It's a very weird situation. And they still did everything they could to make that whole process as comfortable for him as humanly possible. So I recently saw what you're talking about too. They are making the best of it. Like, what money they have, that ceiling in the hallway leading to the ward, that wasn't necessarily the most important thing. Making sure that the patients were getting what they needed was, and that was always seems to be the priority. But let's just say that ceiling shouldn't be like that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
The hospital shouldn't have to resort to turning off all the lights on a ward, hoping to God that makes things a couple of degrees cooler, which is what they ended up doing at one point. Gosh. Maybe the NHS should be able to afford to buy some fans.
Indeed. Although
that would be nice.
Yes, but so I got lucky when I was because I was in a room by myself. I had a private room, which I was really relieved to have. But on the ward there was several different smallish rooms that had maybe between 4 and 6 patients in them, but had the COVID restrictions still very much been in place, they probably wouldn't have been able to have a fan in those rooms because the thinking would be it's blowing the virus around, and so they wouldn't have been able to have any fans at all in those rooms. But I had one. I got one of my wonderful girlfriends to bring a fan to me at the hospital, and then I just had it, perched on, I forget what it was. It was on the sink, actually. And on one of the chairs, and in various places, but always pointing directly at me. So then I had this fan going, usually full blast, pointed directly at me. And even though it was kind of just pushing warm air around, it made enough of a difference. So, yeah. And then, so I wanted to thank them, even though obviously it had been literally the most difficult month of my life. It was painful. It was really, really not very fun. But I wanted to show my appreciation. So rather than standing outside on a Thursday and just clapping randomly, I made some fudge. And when I was in the hospital the following week for a different appointment, I went by the ward and I gave the fudge to the staff that were on duty, and I said, here you go, this is for you, I've made it, please enjoy it, and thank you for all your hard work. And thank you for looking after me.
Well done. You actually did something material.
Well, I figured you can't go wrong with a massive amount of sugar, you know?
You really can't.
And yeah, so I know somebody who has worked in hospitals for a long time, and she was very much on the side of, yeah, absolutely, just make something with a load of sugar in it. So it was going to be either like fancy cookies or fudge. But I've not made fudge for a while, so I thought, well, I'll do that. So, yeah.
And to bring this back round a bit,
yes.
like I was doing all the reading about our news story in the NHS Confederation, looking at what they do. And I'd say about 95% of their work, based on looking at their website and their social media output and seeing what they're putting out into the world, appears to be focused on, well, the funding crisis in the NHS and how that interacts with the cost of living crisis and everything else. That seems to be most of their work, but I think most people will have heard of them for the first time because they put aside, because their LGBTQ group inside the wider organisation got a bit of money together and wanted to do a thing on making things easier for trans people, which, as you have talked about, there are barriers to healthcare, even in the best of circumstances. Like the stuff about the catheter and dysphoria, those are everyday realities for trans people seeking care from the NHS.
Exactly.
It's like all of the grown-ups who are supposed to be in charge of things have just completely, well, they never really did have their eye on the ball, did they?
Not these quote-unquote adults, no. They had their eye on their payday.
Yeah, and it feels like I'm rubbing up to say that it wasn't always like this, that there were good people once. And I think to a certain extent that is kind of true. I mean, if you took most of the Conservative Party of, say, 40 years ago, and not talking social issues here, but if you looked at them and what they were about, they were trying to make a payday for their masters, but they also kind of knew what they were doing.
Yes.
They could make sure that the country runs badly, runs in unequally, but there were a lot less crises than there are now.
Yes.
Like, I think, and this is not a compliment because I'm not, if anybody who listens to this for any amount of time knows, I am vehemently anti-conservative to my core.
Yes.
I think Margaret Thatcher would have done a better job of handling this stuff, but then a lot of people still would have been hurt, like, horrifically so.
Yes.
But it would have been a slightly better shit situation than this one. And that is the closest to nostalgia for the good old days I'm going to get. The previous bastards who were bastards were at least kind of competent, whereas this lot just aren't at all. Or at least have stopped caring about looking competent.
I think that might be it. Rather than them not being competent, they're actually very competent at strip mining the NHS and selling off its assets to their friends. They are really good at that. And they're so good at it, they don't care. They don't care if people catch them at it. They don't care what the public thinks of them. They're just in it for the money. For them and their, I don't want to say cronies, but that's kind of who they are. People who've been elevated way above their level of competence. Not the level of confidence. There is nothing so confident as a mediocre white man, especially if he's a conservative. But yes, elevated way above what they're actually skilled at doing, and they've just been told, just sell everything and give us the money, and we'll give you a kickback. And that's...
You know, I think we really need to get a conservative on the podcast.
Do we have to?
I think that... Well, I think that would be an episode that would be very, very informative, if for no other reason than we would be able to talk to a conservative and be like, so what the fuck?
Yeah.
And they'd offer an explanation which at least we could then understand it. I think that's been my biggest problem for my whole life.
Yeah, that's fine.
I've not been able to fundamentally understand how someone could decide that the Conservative Party were a good idea at any point in my life, and even before I was born. But there are people who do. There are people who clearly do. So I think I'd like to know what that is.
Yeah.
Not because I think that's going to persuade me at this point that they're actually a force for good, but just so I can say, you know what, I understand these people more now. They aren't just a faceless enemy that are Satan. They're real people who came to a conclusion. And I want to understand that process. I mean, what do you think, listeners? Let us know. Should we have a conservative person on the podcast? Because I know a bunch. I know a few. I talk to them. I talk to them, and I even like some of them as people, as long as we don't talk about certain things ever.
Yeah.
That is a thing.
Fair enough. Well, yes, let's see what the listeners...
I mean, do you know conservatives, Ashleigh?
No, I don't. I live in Manchester. Everyone's a communist.
Like, I live in supposedly, like, lefty London, but then I meet people who are conservative. I've met conservative trans people who live in Manchester. I've probably met more than you have by the sounds of it, but they're out there. They exist. There will be some listening. So if you're listening, I don't understand you. I just don't understand why.
If you're listening...
More people die when the Tories are in charge. Like, it's a baseline for political ideology.
I guess my only...
I think that's important.
Yeah, indeed. I guess my only real question for conservatives of all stripes, trans and otherwise, is what the fuck is wrong with you? Anyway...
Well, then I would argue we should have one on the podcast and ask that question.
Yeah. I mean, the annoying thing is, out of the... in a concession to at least not making the person really angry straight away, we might need to ask that question, but, make it pretty. We don't want to trigger them, of course. It's far, us mean, nasty, evil transes triggering conservatives. That's the real cancel culture.
Oh, we wouldn't have a cis conservative on. Unless they were like an MP or something. I don't think we would do that. I think we probably need to discuss this as a policy thing for what the trans, but I was thinking it would be a trans conservative at the very least.
Fair enough. Well, do let us know. And in fact,
let us know what you think of this plan, if it's complete nonsense or not. You could contact us on all of the things, whatthetrans.com, Twitter, whatthetrans, Facebook, whatthetrans, and we have a Patreon. You can tell us over that whether it's a good or bad idea or not, or you could donate money.
I mean, you could,
whichever you like.
You're quite welcome to do both, of course. But yes, thank you for putting up with me, mostly talking about my extended hospital stay. Obviously, the problems with the NHS and indeed with the government and the Conservative leadership election/selection process. I don't know how it works. Something about putting arrowheads or stones in a bowl and then the white smoke gives a signal. I don't know. Yes, but thank you all for listening, and we shall be back without quite so much of a break before the next episode. But yes, thank you all for listening, and ta-ta, see you next time.
This episode of What the Trance was written and produced by Ashleigh Talbot and Michelle Snow, and was edited by me,
who is Michelle Snow. And we'd especially like to thank our producer-level Patreons. Thank you very much. You guys help us do all of the stuff that we are trying to do, and there is some stuff happening behind the scenes which we are hopefully going to be able to share with you quite soon, and that we're actually quite excited about. But our Patreon producers are Lentil,
Philippa Taproga,
Ramona Martinez,
Alethea Aurora,
Chagall, they, them,
Clara Villayami,
Amelia,
Samantha,
Kara, the asexual turf buster, and her trusty sidekick Jiggly Jugs,
Candy Cox,
Zeph,
Fiona McDonald,
Torisco Hitch,
Murgatroyd,
Claire Renshaw,
Ontologically Unjust,
Stevie Lang,
Stella,
Michaela Irish,
Syndigosa,
Rebecca Prentice,
Graham Mulholland,
Crazy Richard,
Dan Oblivion,
Georgina Young,
Ty Griffiths,
Florence Stanley,
Riley,
Helen _
Chrissy Jarvis,
So what do we chat about for Quinn?
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Melody Nix,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn Mackay,
Nick Duffy,
CB Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Wen Witherup,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Atom James,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Patreon user,
Vic Kelly,
Emma Doyle,
Catherine,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Kuma,
Karakin12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean,
Lanos,
and Chris Hubley. Thank you so much to you all, and we'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.